our guest today, we are so happy to introduce you to, because as Miguel said, we are great fans of his work, and he joins us from the States, or actually from Canada. And I would really love to talk about the elections, I have to say, because it's a momentous time in our history, but our topic today is much less divisive, less bound to multiply controversy or add discomfort. Yet it is not totally unrelated, because when it comes to counting votes, we need something special, and that is numbers. And to talk about them and how numbers, numerical notations, written numbers came to be used in the world and came about in the world, and how they interact with language, with symbols, with social and economic context, and much, much more, we have truly, if not one of the top experts, the top expert, really, and a true interdisciplinary scholar. Let me introduce you to Dr. Stephen Chrisomalis from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Stephen is a linguistic anthropologist specializing in the anthropology of mathematics and the interaction of language, cognition, and culture. His book, Numerical Notation, A Comparative History, was published by CUP, Cambridge University Press, in 2010. And in this book, Stephen gives us, for the very first time, I think, a cross-cultural cognitive analysis of written numerals. And I was amazed when I first read it, how pioneering it is. I think what Stephen did had never been done before from a global perspective. And let me give you a sneak preview and a piece of good news. A new book by Stephen will be out in December, I take it, and it echoes the title of today's Scribo, Reckonings, Numerals, Cognition, and History. And it's going to come out with MIT Press. The title is great because to reckon is a verb with several different meanings: to think, to judge, to calculate. And I have to say, Stephen, congratulations, because the book has a great cover too. And I pre-ordered it today. So I'm really looking forward to reading it. Before we start, let me remind you that in 2 weeks' time, on the 11th of November, probably with a new president, we will have another guest from the States, Felipe Rojas from Brown University. But now over to you, Stephen, with reading, writing, and reckoning, numerical notation as a global modality. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here with us today.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and good morning. I want to thank Sylvia and Miguel and everyone from the Inscribe ERC project for inviting me here and to give a talk today in the Scribo series. I want to invite anyone who has any questions to use the chat function in Zoom. If you have questions along the way and I can get to them, there will be time after my talk for a question and answer. So definitely feel free to ask questions. But for now, I want to get right into it. All right. Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. My name is Stephen Chrisomalis. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. And today I want to talk to you about numbers. Now, we live in a world of written numbers. And so if you were to just take a moment and look around your surroundings, you would almost certainly find written numbers because they're absolutely ubiquitous in modern societies. So for instance, under your chair, you might find a serial number, and all kinds of numerical information. Inside a wedding ring, a carat mark. At a baseball game, some place that some of us remember once going to, once upon a time. A scoreboard, the bottom of the seventh with my team up 1. And we see all of this numerical reflection and this numerical information. But we don't think to ourselves very often, what would it be like to not have it? In other words, what would it be like to not have this sort of information? For us, it's so ubiquitous, so everyday, so commonplace that we don't reflect the fact that we probably see more numbers in a given day than we do sunsets or songs or smiles. And that's true now, but that wasn't true 10,000 years ago or probably even 5,000 years ago, and maybe not even 500 years ago. So what I want to do today is to take what we know, what gives us our comfort zone, and move us into something that might be a little more unfamiliar to some of us, but to link the history of numeration to the history of writing, and to think about how did the current state of affairs come to be. And so I have some key questions that I want to ask today. These are very, very big questions, and I don't claim that I'll be able to answer them fully in a brief talk. But first, to ask, why do humans use numerical signs? This might seem self-evident, but I'm going to insist that it isn't. That in fact, there are lots of humans who never use numerical signs. They're intelligent, cognitively complex humans just like us. They don't. But why do we now do so? How did it come about that we do so? This relates then to the second question: in what contexts do complex numerical notations emerge? So in other words, knowing that at one point it wasn't the case and that now it is, how did we get from here to there? And then third, and this is a sort of central question that I want to explore today, what are the relationships between three different modalities, or three different ways of representing? And those are tallying and numerical notation and writing. Okay, so I've used this word modality. Let me explain what I mean, because I think it's important. So when I talk about a modality, and you know, this is a very, very introductory semiotics lecture, I guess we would say, that there are different ways of representing any kind of information that we might have. So for instance, let's imagine that you want to indicate the meaning stop. Well, how can you do it? You can write it down with the word stop, or of course, whatever language you want to. You could say it, you could say the word stop. You could gesture, I can hold my hand out like this, or I can use an ideogram. I can use some object or image that conveys the idea, like a red octagon. And all of these convey the same meaning, but they do so in different ways. Now, we also know that we can combine those. So for instance, a stop sign normally has both the written word stop and a red octagon. But note that you actually don't need it. So for instance, if you're driving down the road and you see a red octagon, but it didn't happen to have the word stop on it, I'm going to bet that you're still going to stop your car. Please, please, if you see a red octagon, stop your car just in case, even if the word stop isn't there. So we're seeing the way that modalities work to create meaning. Now, when we look at numbers, we see the same sorts of things apply. That if I want to convey a number like 4, I can use a written number word, or I can speak a word, or I can use a gesture, or I can use an ideogram. I can use some number signs that indicate some numerical concept. And so I think the way that I want to think about this today is to think about not just what is being said or what is being conveyed, but how it's being conveyed. And then to recognize that there's a lot of choice we have when we represent numbers, and that choosing which kind of number we want to represent and how we want to represent it is equally important as the question of what number actually do we want to represent. So now I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to show you this slide and ask, is this a number? This is an incised hyena femur from the site of Les Pradelles in France. The date is roughly 72,000 to 60,000 years old. And this is not created by an anatomically modern human. These notches, this is a Mousterian site. This is sort of a Neanderthal site many, many thousands of years ago. So we could ask the question, is this a number? And I don't know the answer to this. And Francesco D'Errico, who's the archaeologist who's investigated this question most seriously, doesn't know the answer, but he thinks that it is numerical, that it is that as early as 72,000 years ago, individuals who are not anatomically modern human, still part of our human lineage, are engaging in numerical practices, marking tallies on bone. And in fact, there's a long history of this throughout the Paleolithic. So for instance, we can see here, this is the so-called swimming reindeer from the site of Montastruc in France. And this is much more recent, 13,000 years ago, but still a very long time ago. And that these sorts of markings that use single marks to represent single objects seem to be fairly ubiquitous throughout the Paleolithic. In other words, this is one of the earliest global modalities for representing number, tallying, using a single mark to represent a single object. And so we could offer up what I will call the continuity thesis. And that's the idea that numerical notations, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, are historically continuous from and emerge from these tallying practices that go back to the Paleolithic. But I want to emphasize that these are actually two different things. They seem very similar, and in fact, they have a family resemblance, and I wouldn't seek to deny that. But in fact, I'm going to insist that they're different modalities, that they represent numbers in fundamentally different ways. So here I'm going to give you some examples, some abstract examples of what tallies can look like. The ones we looked at from the Paleolithic are what we would call unstructured. In other words, they don't have any organization to them. They simply use a single mark to represent a single object, and that continues as long as you need them. But you can do things to mark tallies, to organize them. And so, for instance, you could structure them spatially in groups of 5, and in the last one, I have a group of 4. So we can very rapidly count this as equal to 24, whereas the first one is actually very hard for us to count as 24. You'd be sitting there for an awful long time, and you'd have to double check it. We can also structure them graphically. I can make the 5th mark a little bit different. I can put it at an angle. Or I can even use different kinds of marks for instance, the 5th and the 10th tallies. And so this is what I would call the complex tally at the bottom. And so basically, these are ways of organizing numerical information that look like numerical notation, but I'm going to show you that they're actually quite different. So what we see at the bottom here is a Zuni tally stick. And it's got both tallying on the right, which is A, B, C, and D, and numerical notation at the left, which is E. And A, B, C, and D constitute one of these complex tallies. The number 24 indicated from right to left, 4 marks, then a slash, 4 more marks, then an X, 4 more marks, then a slash, 4 more marks, then an X, and finally 4 marks. And note at the left, what you have is basically the rough equivalent of the Roman numeral XXIV to indicate 24. That's numerical notation, and these are 2 different ways of representing the same number. Now, tallying uses the principle in cognitive science of one-to-one correspondence, whereby 1 mark equals 1 object. We use one-to-one correspondence all the time. In fact, it's not only pan-human, but it's very clear that lots of animals have the ability to count in a very, very rough way, especially small quantities, by associating single marks with single objects. In other words, that we're able to numerate using this very, very general cognitive principle by which we derive meaning. Now, tallying represents, and this is really essential, an ongoing count. It's open-ended and extendable. And this is, of course, why we still use it today. If you need to take a count of votes, you're going to use a tally because you'll make 1 mark every time because you don't know where it's going to end. At the very end, once the tally is completely taken, you might write it down using numerals. But when you're taking a tally, the really important thing is that you're making an open-ended, ongoing count. And in mathematical terms, tallying relies on the concept of the modulus, which is a cyclical or repeating arithmetical structure. In other words, once I get to 5, I circle back around to 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that I'm not using this in the way that we'll see in numerical notation, structuring it in terms of a base and the powers of a base. So I also want to point out when we're talking about tallying that there are a lot of practices in everyday life that scaffold or support this kind of numerate activity: weaving, knotting and tying, wood carving, and rhythmic ritual. These are cross-culturally widespread practices, and they're characterized by repetitive action and one-to-one correspondence. So in fact, what we see in tallying is an essentially universal human process. Humans count, and one of the ways they count in a visual way is through these open-ended modular tallying systems. In contrast, numerical notation use different signs that are structured in some order, for instance, from highest to lowest powers. And numerical notations represent completed counts. Once it's written, it's not intended to be extended, and in fact, you usually can't extend it. You can always do things like add more zeros, but I can't just add one onto a number that I write and increase the count by one in the way I can with the tally. So numerical notation is quite different in this respect. And in fact, this is because it relies on the concept of the numerical base, which uses powers of some number, most often 10, not always 10. There are systems that use 20 or 60, but 10 is the most common. And they use this concept of the base to structure the meaning. And so this isn't just one-to-one correspondence, and it's not just an extension of tallying, and it's something really quite different. So here we see a typology, and this is the typology that I created for my book, Numerical Notation and Comparative History. There are some other typologies out there. My colleague Dirk Schlimm, who I think is on the call, has a typology which I really quite like as well. I'm not really going to break down all of the different types or the different ways that we could talk about numerical notation, except to note this, that at the top we see these two kinds of systems that we're describing as cumulative. And these systems, like the Roman numerals, sort of look like tallies. We understand that there's a sort of family resemblance between Roman numerals and tallying, but they're really quite different. I can't take this Roman numeral 228 and keep on adding more marks to it to indicate higher and higher numbers. It's really done. It's a completed count. And that's radically different than using one-to-one marks. So I think that's really, really essential to recognize this difference. That all of these things we're looking at the screen now are numerical notations. And they really represent a particular modality, a particular way of representing numbers that differs in a fundamental way from tallying, even though they're both visual, relatively permanent, non-linguistic ways of representing numbers, that tallying and numerical notation are different than one another. Numerical notation is characterized by what I call a compositional logic. And lots of things have a compositional logic, but note how different these three ways of representing the same number would be. I can represent the number 364 in words, and there are 5 morphemes in this case, 306T4. I could represent it with 364 individual signs, like a tally, or I could represent it, as I have here in Egyptian hieroglyphic numerals, with 3 different sign types for hundreds, tens, and ones in 3 different registers with 13 signs. These differences are important because they help us understand how humans make meaning with number. Now I want to turn and talk about how these systems, and particularly how numerical notation, relates to the origins of writing. So here we have 5 writing systems which represent the earliest writing in 5 different regions of the world: in China, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, and in Mesopotamia. And so what these are different forms of writing that convey information in different ways. And they all have a mixture of numerical information and non-numerical information. And all of the earliest writing systems have this quality. Numerical notation doesn't come about later. than writing. It in fact precedes writing or comes about just around the same time as writing. So we really have this co-evolutionary process whereby literacy and numeracy emerge side by side. Prior to that, there was certainly tallying, but only with the advent of writing do you see the advent of numerical notation. It's also really important to note that this doesn't occur in a vacuum, but it occurs in a specific social context. And that specific social context is that they originate in early states, alongside or just before the origins of writing. So in other words, tallying is this cross-culturally universal modality, in the same way that number words are essentially a cross-culturally universal human modality. Humans do them, and there's definitely a lot of debate as to whether number words are in fact cross-culturally universal in languages like Munduruku or Piraha. I don't want to get into those debates today, but to say that essentially all languages have number words, and essentially all people use these sorts of tallying practices that rely on one-to-one correspondence. In contrast, numerical notation exists only in politically complex hierarchical societies, and that's where it comes about. And it comes about alongside the origins of writing. But now we can ask, and we should ask, how and why did it develop when and where it did? So one thesis that's often up, I'll just call it a notion, I suppose, is what we can call Mesopotamian universalism. Now, Mesopotamia, the area largely in modern-day Iraq, is one of the early heartlands of writing. Cuneiform systems, proto-cuneiform notations that precede them, and various systems of tokens and seals that exist in Mesopotamia a very, very long time ago. Probably, we're going to take us back probably to around 3,500 to 3,000 BCE. And because writing emerges there very early, and because there's a lot of evidence for it, it's easy to imagine that what's true of Mesopotamia must be true or is likely to be true everywhere. And so this idea that what writing looks like in one place is likely to be what it looks like in other places is offered up by various authors. So for instance, Postgate, Wang, and Wilkinson back in 1995 said, well, it's true that in other places in the world, we don't have evidence for tokens. And it's true that in most other places in the world, early writing doesn't seem to be for an accounting or a bookkeeping function. That these proto-cuneiform tablets really seem to be kind of bookkeeping documents. And they suggest that maybe that's the general origin of writing. Maybe that's what writing is for, everywhere. Even though we don't have evidence to suggest it, that maybe that evidence just hasn't survived in other parts of the world. And while it is true that we are blessed with an abundance of evidence in Mesopotamia, that I actually don't think this is the best way to approach it. That I actually think when we look at both writing and numerical notation, that throughout the world, the earliest forms of it serve diverse purposes. So yes, in Mesopotamia, early writing and early numerical notation serve a bookkeeping or accounting function. Or in Egypt, where most of the early numeration is used in royal display inscriptions, or in China, where there are, for instance, records of official divinations, or in Mesoamerica, that they're used in dates and calendars. These do have something in common. In every case, writing serves state power. In other words, it serves elites. But it doesn't serve it in a single predictable way. In other words, there's a single context for the emergence of numerical notation worldwide, but there's not a single function for which it's used. Let me demonstrate a little further with a neat artifact. This will be familiar to some of you. This is the Narmer mace head. And this is a stone ceremonial mace head that was found at Hierakonpolis, which is ancient Nechan, in Egypt. And it comes from, we think, the 31st century BCE. So in other words, 3100-ish to 3000 BCE, which is the early dynastic period. It's very, very early. It's a very, very early instance of Egyptian writing, and it's a very, very early instance of Egyptian numeration. And it depicts events in the reign of Narmer, a king. Now, this mace is essentially a ceremonial artifact. It doesn't serve any particular administrative purpose except to illustrate and highlight the power of the ruler. Now, here is a register or a small portion of the Narmer mace head. And what we can see here at the bottom are some representations of 400,000 cattle, 1,422,000 goats, and 120,000 people. And so these are different sorts of representations of 3 different kinds of counts of things. These are by far the largest numbers recorded anywhere in early Egyptian history. They're massive numbers, and they're almost certainly fictitious numbers. In other words, we don't have any reason to suppose that these are actual counts of things. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to herd 1,422,000 goats. It can't be done, much less count them. And so the idea that somehow these represent real counts of things, that this is an administrative document, simply doesn't hold water. And in fact, the fact that the numbers are so round actually is one of the further pieces of evidence that suggests that these are fictive numbers. But nonetheless, they're very powerful numbers. They represent the power of the elite to control, to conquer, to take cattle, goats, and people as part of the conquest of other parts of Egypt. This phenomenon, the use of these very, very large numbers for display purposes. So for instance, if you hold a political rally and want to brag about how many people were at it, this sort of has a family resemblance to that, if that's familiar to anyone. But this, here's another example of the same phenomenon. This is a later object. This is a Latin inscription on the columna rostrata of Gaius Duilius, which is 3rd century BC. And what you see here, it's an account of material that was taken in battle. This is a battle against the Carthaginians, I think. And what we're seeing here is that there's an inscription and it just goes along. And then all of a sudden, the writer starts writing this sign again and again and again. And this is actually the archaic Roman numeral for 100,000. So basically, it's writing again and again and again, 100,000, 100,000, 100,000, 100,000, 100,000. It's like when your child first discovers that you can put the word very as many times as you want into a sentence, and they become very, 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 very annoying. But it serves a purpose, right? It serves a purpose, which is to demonstrate the power of a monarch or a ruler or a general in a highly visible way. So I call this phenomenon conspicuous computation, riffing off of the famous phrase conspicuous consumption from Thorstein Veblen. And basically, conspicuous computation is the conscious, purposeful violation of the principle of least effort applied to numbers, using numbers that are large, that are almost excessively large, for the purposes of aggrandizing. Conspicuous computation is cognitively salient in size, and it can very often be cognitively challenging for readers to process. It's a visual index of control over numbers, as a marker of prestige and elite power. In other words, the purpose is not actually to be an actual count of anything. This isn't an administrative document, but rather their purpose is to highlight the power of the writer or to highlight the purpose of whoever's being described. So of course we understand that scribes are different than the people about whom they're writing, but it's to highlight the power of elites to exercise authority over such large numbers. So conspicuous computation represents a really, really important part of what I think of as the early function of numeration. It's used to indicate in Mesoamerica, for instance, really enormous periods of time beyond human comprehension. And that's not being done because the ancient Maya or the ancient Olmecs are stupid. It's actually quite the opposite. It's because they know very, very well what the power of those large numbers is. Those numbers have real power. They really matter. The last thing I want to talk, so what we see here is that numbers overall are for representing, not really for computing with numbers. Now, we as modern Western people have sort of fused these two functions. We learn pen and paper arithmetic in elementary school, and we come to assume that that's what numbers are for. But historically, this is very, very rare. Numerical notation has never been for arithmetic. You can use it for arithmetic, but it's sort of like a side effect. And this is a term known by Stephen Jay Gould as exaptation, something that sort of evolutionarily speaking or historically speaking serves a new function for which it was never intended. Numerical notations emerge with the state, but not for a single narrow function like keeping your empire running by keeping the books. You could do it that way, you could do it for that, but that's not the purpose. And so numerical notation and writing similarly emerge for these diverse range of functions that serve elite ends, but not a single function. Last, I want to turn to something really important, which is to recognize that there are actually many ways to write any number, and that we actually have a lot more choice than we imagine when we write any number. So for instance, here are some representations of the number 1105. We could put an and in there or not, or we could say 1105 or not. We could say 1105. We could tally it. That's a pretty long one to write 1105 tally marks. But we have numerical notation, and we have various choices of what we could say. We can actually even combine these. We can't do this with 1105, but we can use, like in a number like 42 million, I can write the 42 in numerals and the million in words. We do this all the time. So we have a lot of flexibility when we write numbers. And in fact, if you look at any text, if you open up any book, you'll see some rich combination of these different modalities on the page. So here's an example from antiquity that I think is really quite interesting. And this is an Aramaic lion weight from the 8th century BCE, and it's now in the British Museum. And it has some various inscriptions. In fact, it has 3 inscriptions on it. And they all represent the same value, which is 15 minas, which is a unit of weight, which is then used to measure value. And so on the right flank, what we have is a horizontal line representing 10, followed by 5 lines representing 1. And that is a numerical notation to represent 15. On the right at the base, there is the Aramaic number word, hamasht ashar, which is basically 15 minas. And so 15 is represented using words, which of course we could do as well, writing it out F-I-F-T-E-E-N. And then on the left flank, there's a tally with 15 tally marks. Now, when we see this, we should ask, why did the writer choose to do it this way? Was it playful? It could just be playful, right? That's a possibility. But there are other possibilities. One is that the writer didn't just want to indicate it in one way because it's sort of a check. In the same way that when we write a check, if any of us actually still write physical checks, we write the number out in numerals and then we write the number out in words. Those are supposed to match, and if they don't match, there's a problem. So maybe this is kind of a checks and balances thing. But maybe it also serves a different audience. So for instance, tallies are easy to understand. You don't need to be literate to understand those 15 marks on the left flank. You simply can look at it and you can count them, and then you know that there's 15. Now you don't have all of the context, but you have some of the context. You know there's 15 of something, and because it's a weight, you can maybe figure that out. And then of course we have both the number word and the number symbols. And I actually think the reason for this is actually one of the very early Aramaic inscriptions. And I actually think that one of the reasons why that the number word and the number symbol are both on this inscription is that those number symbols were actually quite new at that point. And I think there's every reason to imagine that maybe people didn't understand them. But the other thing to think about is that even if you're literate, if you don't speak Aramaic, then understanding the number words may be beyond you. So there might be a bilingualism or multilingualism factor involved here. But what we can see here is there are actually some very good reasons to have these multiple counts on the same object. So now we come to a very fundamental sociolinguistic principle, which is the idea of code choice. And we should ask ourselves not just what's the number and how does it get written, but who writes numbers, for what audiences, in what modalities, and why. And once you do that, you're asking sociolinguistic questions about writing, not notational questions that are just about mathematics. And I think this is where we really benefit from a broader sociolinguistic cultural perspective on numerical notation rather than a strictly notational or mathematical one. In summary, numerical notation is one of several modalities for representing numbers. It's one that emerges alongside the origin of writing for diverse representative functions. Arithmetic and bookkeeping are there, but they're not central, and in most cases, we don't have a lot of evidence that these numbers are being used arithmetically, especially in the early periods. And finally, and very importantly, writers have agency to choose how to write numbers based on their own goals and interests. And that can include richly combining those modalities in a host of ways. So I want to thank you all for your time and your attention. Here are my two books, Numerical Notation, my older book, and my new book is much cheaper, but also I have to say much better. I'm very proud that it'll be coming out soon. And it's very exciting to be able to share a little piece of that work with you here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was great. And I love, like I said, I love the cover of your upcoming book. And now you can see it all. Everybody can see it. Thank you. It was wonderful. I would like to ask you a question before I leave the questions to the floor. I was reading a couple of years ago a very interesting article by Menery at the University of Melbourne on mathematical cognition. Mm-hmm. And he basically said that, well, he basically claims that we have, well, humans as a universal have an approximate number system. Mm-hmm. And that with evolution, with cultural evolution, and he stresses cultural very much, a discrete number system kicks in, which basically refines our perception of how numbers work. So we step out of a numerosity perception and we get into a more defined, systematic way of dealing with numbers. And he seems to stress very much that teaching and generational harnessing and transmission of the information of the numerosity can then channel into a system that's more institutionalized. And if I understand correctly your stance, it seems that the early state or the early complex society can get us from that tallying sort of basic analogic non-linguistic capacity to recognize quantity and numbers onto a more structured and more articulate way of getting to the discrete system perception, and that the state is tantamount to the sort of the channeling process, is important, is fundamental in channeling the possibility of discrete number systems existing. Am I correct in seeing this in this very simplistic way? Because if that is the case, then we would expect numbers or systems of numbers, systems of numerical notation to crop up whenever writing is invented, but then we have outliers.
Right. So I think that that's not quite what I'm saying, and I want to clarify what I mean. First of all, I think that all sorts of people who don't live in states have what you're describing as a discrete number sense, which is really just the ability to, up to some fairly high numbers, to identify, for instance, the difference between 29 and 30. If you have a number word system, you don't need any notation whatsoever to be able to indicate, to be able to know that, well, if I have 29 and then I'll go to 30, and if I have one more, I'll have 31. That I don't think you need the state for that, and I wouldn't want to suggest that people who aren't living in states don't have that discrete number sense. I think the number words alone are enough to give you that. There certainly are interesting cultural evolutionary things going on there, but those really bear more on some debates that go on that I referred to earlier, which is debates over whether there are some people who have no number words whatsoever, but only have an approximative number sense. That is otherwise cognitively modern, perfectly intelligent people who, because they don't have the representations in the form of number words, don't have what we would understand as a discrete or an abstract counting sequence. This is not actually what I'm saying here, that I think once numerical notation is actually doing something quite different, that I think it does let you do certain things with numbers that you couldn't otherwise do. It lets you represent quite large quantities visually in a fairly compact way, but that you can't do, for instance, with tallying. But I don't consider tallying to be a primitive or early form, because it's still so useful to us. We need tallying.
Yeah.
And so for me, you really have to ask, what's the function of any particular notation that you use? Once you understand the function, then you can ask those cognitive questions. But I think in the case of numerical notation, it would be a mistake to infer too much from the notation alone. That I think what we really want to do is understand that, you know, a toddler and a topologist both use the same set of numbers, but cognitively they're radically different. And understanding how numbers are used in practice really will help us. It doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to the structure, but that we don't derive anything strictly from the structure of numerical notation.
Right, very clear. I have another question about cognition, but let me leave the questions to the audience. Anybody that would want to ask a question to Stephen?
And I have a question.
Also have the chat open if people have questions that they want to put there. But
yeah, no questions so far. We have Amalia.
I have a question.
Hi.
Yeah, great talk, Stephen. Loved it. I was wondering whether, like, I noticed you were using the word number. In context that I would personally use the word numeral, and so I was just wondering whether you have a stance on when to use which word and which not. You know, whether you want to like derive a clear difference between those terms.
Thank you, Amalia, and it's wonderful to see you. It's been too long.
Yeah.
I do have a stance, but you're going to be disappointed, which is that my stance is that in talks that are given to a very general audience where I don't know who exactly is going to be there, I often use the word number in a very, very general way. All of these words are very, very deeply polysemous. Even numeral is problematic, right? Because we use numeral both to refer to spoken or written words, or to refer to graphic notation. I don't, if this were a philosophy of mathematics talk, I think I would be much more insistent on using number only in a very, very narrow sense. I think probably for today, I was just using it in a fairly general sense to indicate probably in a way that was a little more haphazard than I would in a different sort of talk. So
we have a question in the chat, but we also have Grace East, if you would like to come on video.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, good to see everyone.
Hi.
This was so fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And I think something that like really stuck with me that I like want to think more about is the idea of conspicuous computation. And it feels like, I know you made this allusion, but it feels like very relevant to like current rhetoric, politically and otherwise. And I guess I was curious if you had like any more, I guess, insight on like how it works like iconically, because I was thinking about like the way that we see this like number that has, I guess, like a specific actual meaning like behind, you know, the notation, but it to me seemed like it had some sort of like iconicity that was like just like sheerly like representational of like power or something like that. So I wonder if you could sort of talk maybe a little bit more about that.
Right. So I'm going to actually, to answer your question, no, I don't want to do that. To answer your question, which is entirely apt, which is to say that, yeah, I mean, that these things are semiotic relationships. So if you want to do conspicuous consumption, for instance, maybe if you're Egyptian, you want to build an enormous pyramid. Or that if you're American, maybe you want to build an enormous wall. And that conspicuous computation is semiotically rich, but economically it's cheap. It's like as if you put out a picture of a wall on Twitter, and then everyone all of a sudden understands that there is a wall that's being built. And so this is kind of the numerical equivalent of that. It's a way of representing a number to an audience. It's also really important to note that one of the values of, for instance, the columna rostrata and documents like that is that most of the readers of this text would not have been literate. Literacy rates in ancient Rome, especially in the 3rd century BCE, going to be maybe 10% at tops, right? So this giant monumental inscription, the value of the writing is not necessarily to be read as language, but to be seen and to be understood as a form of representation. But the value of the numerals is that you almost don't need to be able to read at all to draw meaning from those. And in fact, because there's a sort of element of numeracy that sort of precedes literacy, you could just say, like, whatever that is, whatever that number is, it's big.
Yeah.
And because we actually, after a certain point, humans are terrible at understanding large numbers. So for instance, there's very good cognitive science that shows that if you give people 3 numbers, 1,000, 1,000,000, and 1 billion, and they ask you to put them on a number line, put them in relation to one another, that very often they'll put 1,000 and 1,000,000 and 1 billion, and then put million sort of like just kind of halfway in between. But of course, 1,000,000 is 1,000th of 1 billion. Basically, if you put those together, 1,000 and 1,000,000 should be way on the left-hand side, and 1 billion should be way on the right-hand side. It's one little letter, M versus B, but it makes a huge difference. But conspicuous computation can kind of draw on that fact that after a certain point, numbers are just baffling to most people. And numerical representations thus don't need to be exact. They're not intended for that purpose. So thank you for your question.
Thanks, Steve.
Do we have any instance of Mesopotamia at the beginning using that conspicuous computation?
So Mesopotamia is really interesting. Early Mesopotamia, no. You do have examples. Most of the Mesopotamian texts we have, especially the early texts, are really quite small, and they're not display inscriptions. Later, you absolutely do. So if you look at Sargonic period stuff, this is 2,000 years after the origins of writing, though, and so it's probably not really what you're talking about. At that point, say in the 1st millennium BC, you absolutely have large display inscriptions with large numbers advertising or promoting the power of elites to control resources, for instance. Early on, you don't really have that, but there are objects like some of these early texts, the so-called Weld-Blundell prism, which I talk about in my new book, which is this basically text reckoning the ages of different rulers. And there are basically these large, fictively round numbers, like people living 36,000 years and things like that. So the text is very small, but the number is very big. But again, with text like that, we always have to think about the audience. Who's likely to see it, and who are you trying to impress, or what are you trying to do with it? So in terms of conspicuous computation, that's always the relevant question.
On this topic, we have Professor Jacob Dahl from Oxford, so I'll leave the floor to him.
Oh, well, Jacob knows far more than I do about this subject, so I'm sure he's going to school now.
I don't know if I do on this particular topic, but I find it very interesting. And I think there's a relatively recently published limestone plaque published by Steinkeller that has also these very large numbers. And that is a display object of these, and I think it's early third millennium.
Oh.
But what is the deal with these numbers on the NAMA palette? They don't seem round. All our big numbers, all our conspicuous numbers in Mesopotamia are round or almost round numbers. And your columna rostrata is visually pleasing, right? It's visually nice to look at. Here, they don't appear round to me. How do you get to these numbers? Did they just grab something fantastical and added some extra digits in here? I mean, not digits, but extra sign. Is it random, or is there behind some thinking that gets them to that?
So I'm actually gonna go back to the Narmer mace head here for a second. And one of the things I want you to note is just how compact this all is. Imagine that the actual number was 800,000 cattle. So instead of 400,000 cattle, that you had 800,000. It would actually be quite difficult to fit 4 more signs in here. So one of the reasons I actually think that these are fictive is that the numbers in each place value, quote unquote, these aren't place value numbers, are quite small, 1, 2, 4. So I think this is actually one of the pieces of evidence that shows that these are essentially made up numbers. So if you had a real number, of course, you would expect the numbers to be distributed from 0 through 9, but you don't have that. You have all these nice small little numbers which just conveniently fit into the register where you're putting them. So I actually think this is sort of serving this purpose, but it sort of has to fit within. The mace head is not so big, right? It's not a giant, epigraphic inscription on a wall where you have, feet of space. Someone's given a very small area. It's like, put some big numbers in there for the king. And I really think that's the way we would think about it. Yeah. These numbers are big, but the only way it works is because you have numerical notation where you can use these big signs. Each of those are actually tadpoles, those little black squiggly things for the cattle. And those each represent 100,000. But it gives you a way to do that without taking up so much space that you can't accomplish the goal.
That would fit with very well the ideas that we have about early Mesopotamia, that scribes of administrative text, they know their numbers. They write coherent numbers and so on. And scribes in literary text, they make up stuff. They write that it fits in a different way. It doesn't have to fit mathematically, but it fits in a different way. I had another question if there's time.
Sure.
I don't know if there's time.
We have plenty.
It's such a great chance to be able to ask Stephen these questions. And I was very inspired by the talk. So if we go to the lion weight, he talked about how you can how the person who made the weight represented the same numerical information in different modes. And that was possible to do, and that served different purposes. But I wonder whether must there not always have been complex written numerical notations behind complicated financial or business operations? So isn't this a translation? The 15 dots is a translation for those who don't understand it, but most of the merchants would not have been able to perform the operations that were necessary for daily tasks without some sort of numerical system. Wouldn't you think that? Or do you have examples where these I was thinking about the slightly earlier caravan documents of the old Assyrian period, which would be hugely difficult to keep in your head without numerical system, without numerical notations on clay in that case, but on other materials in other places.
So I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because I actually think we have good evidence that not only that it was done, but we know how it was done. So for instance, I think if we look to the very, very large, complex West African states, pre-colonial West Africa, that we don't have any numerical notation, we don't have any writing, but we have really, really complex numerical calculation that's being undertaken. And we know how it was undertaken. We have good records, and it's being undertaken physically, right? That we're manipulating objects. And of course, even your average Roman, you calculate using an abacus, and then you write the number if you need to. The number is for representation. Now, I understand that your point is, how do you manage an empire without numerical notation? And this is basically the argument that Postgate, Wang, and Wilkinson raised in 1995, which is, well, they must have been doing something. So even if we don't know what it was probably like it was in Mesopotamia. But I actually don't think that's necessarily true. I actually think that we're underestimating non-literate people if we imagine that they can't do it. And this goes directly to the point that you actually don't need writing to manage a large state. That we have numerous examples in the ethnographic record and the archaeological record of very, very large states being managed without writing. Once you accept that's the case, then I think that opens up a space to then have an interesting debate. To what extent? And I'm not saying the answer is zero. I think you're right. Like in the case of the Aramaic lion weight, we know enough about what's going on here to know that there is something underpinning that. But I think there are lots and lots of other cases where I don't assume that just because you have a complex trade system or just because you have a complex administrative system that you must have numerical notation. I don't think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't break at any level of cognition where there's certainly a kind of complex overlay where you won't get to that. Do you think?
That's a great question. And I think, the question of could you manage a large industrial state? Could you manage, could Italy be managed without numerical notation? Probably not. Although, I'll leave that to the Italians to debate on how well that could be done. But I think it would be very hard at a certain point. There's certainly questions of social scale that would be pertinent, I think, there to really ask the question of how much interaction is taking place face-to-face and how much of it requires communication between parties who don't know one another and don't have any other way of communicating with one another. And those are really, really good questions, but I think we can only answer them on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, we have a question from Sarah Finlayson. Does the number of tallying presuppose the existence of number words?
So that is actually a really good question. Heike Wiese, who is done a lot of work on sort of Paleolithic cognition and from a sort of cognitive developmental psychological perspective, thinks that actually number words came later. I have some doubts about that. I think it's very, very hard to know because I think in all of the cases we know of ethnographically or historically or archaeologically, we have both tallying and number words. The only, so basically Wiese is kind of trying to take us back to the Paleolithic. And her idea is maybe that number words and tallying are either codependent on one another in some way, that basically the one couldn't exist without the other. I don't know any way to resolve that empirically because we're talking about the Upper Paleolithic or earlier, we're talking about thousands and thousands of years ago. There's no writing. And I find it very, very difficult to know how you'd resolve that issue in a way that I would consider to be empirically satisfactory.
I have a question on that, but we have Peter Anik. I have a question on the origins of numerical notation and writing. Peter, would you like to come on video?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Steve. And this is Peter Anik from Brandeis. And kind of a related question. You talk about numerical notation arising around the same time as writing systems. And I'm wondering if there are examples of numerical notation that have arisen and then a writing system isn't occurring at the same time. So for example, like megalithic Britain or Bronze Age Scandinavia, where you had very complex rock art traditions. Do you find any evidence of numerical notation preceding writing systems?
So the short answer is no. That if it were my Andean colleagues would, I think there may be a couple of Andeanists in the crowd, but I think one of the difficulties in looking at the quipu, the Inca quipu are often offered up as, oh, that's a numerical system, not a writing system. Mm-hmm. And so this would be the kind of example you'd be looking for where you have numerical notation without writing. The problem with that is that the quipus are actually really, really semantically rich documents. And the fact that we can only read the numerical part of them doesn't mean that that's the only thing there. In fact, we know that there has to be more there. They're using color and they're using shape and they're using organization to convey some information. We just don't know what it is we can read the numerical signs on the quipu. And so this has kind of led to this ideological claim, which is that that the Inca are using numerical notation, but not writing. But I don't think that's well justified. In fact, if I were to compare the quipus to anything, I would compare them very closely to the proto-cuneiform tablets used in early Mesopotamia. They seem to hold the same sorts of information that they may not encode. Thank you, Jakob. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I think that if we're going to call one of these writing, we have to call both of them writing. And if we're going to call them both proto-writing, then I'm fine with that. I'm fine with saying that numerical notation emerges along with proto-writing. But that's a fine distinction that I don't think we don't need to fight that battle. But no, I don't think we have good evidence for the emergence of numerical notation as opposed to just tallying outside of these early written contexts.
Yeah, how about the other way around? Do you have any examples of early writing that don't include numerical notation?
Again, the answer seems to be no. That in fact, it's really tricky to know. There are a couple of interesting marginal cases, which are the Indus Valley, the Harappan civilization, and Easter Island, the Rongo-Rongo.
I was going to ask you exactly about that, Stephen.
And so, given that we can't actually decipher either of these, I'm actually reluctant to say that they don't have numerical notation. And one of the reasons is exactly this, that the reason why we think we know what a number looks like is if we presume that numbers have, I'm going to show you, one of these cumulative structures. Yeah. That we can kind of look at these long series of marks and say, oh, those are repetitive and there's a systematicity to them. And so those look like numbers. But if we had if one of these systems had a number system like, for instance, the Greek alphabetic numerals, which basically use the letters of the Greek alphabet to give them each numerical values, I don't think there's any way we would know.
Highly iconic signs.
Yeah, there are so many other ways that you could convey numerical information. Both of these cases have been hotly debated in the literature, and I'm not a Polynesianist, so I don't want to get into the rather heated debates about Rapa Nui and Rongo-Rongo. But those kinds of cases are ones where there is a ton of debate. But you mean a clear-cut case where there's writing without numerical notation originating sort of independently? No. There are certainly later down the road, like where sort of secondary developments occur. You don't need numerical notation. So, for instance, if you look at some of the scripts of island Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Sumatra, they don't have numerals. But those weren't independently originated. So it's not that you absolutely need it. It's that those come about as sort of secondary developments.
So we need to look for numerals in Rongo-Rongo to actually gauge whether it's an invention or not.
I think that is a subject.
Yeah, that is the way to go.
And another specialist. That's not I'm staying well away from that one.
Well, Inscribe is very much interested in Rongo-Rongo, but that was exactly my question, to what extent the invention of writing goes with the invention of numerical system. Any more questions from anyone?
I wanted to ask one small thing.
Alejandro, hi.
Hello. So just one small, I don't know if it's an idea floating in my head, but it's always this question that I have in Mesoamerican scripts and the presence of zero. You know, we have in the Mesoamerican long count, specifically used in Isthmian script and Cerro de las Mesas examples and, well, the Maya area. The fact that we have this zero being developed very late after the long count was actually developed. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you could make any comments on this, and also the fact that the zero was not diffused to other notation systems in Mesoamerica. It was specifically limited to the long count.
So one of the complexities with Mesoamerican numeration as a whole is that the vast majority of numerical inscriptions in Mesoamerica are calendric in nature. In other words, they're representing either calendar dates or they're representing periods of time. And this is so taken for granted, I think, among Mesoamericanists that we don't stop to think about just how weird it is that you don't have anything like this. You don't have inscriptions that say, you know, we conquered this city and killed 20,000 people. That, you know, there are these representations of these enormous calendrical periods, but you don't have representations of quantities of goods in the way that you do even in Highland Mesoamerica. Aztec manuscripts do this all the time. They're representing bags of cacao and all of this, but there's very, very little. There's a few, and there's really interesting ones, but you're quite right, they don't use zero. We imagine that the reason we have zero is to make numbers big. Like we imagine that and this is what we learned in school, right? We learned that, oh, one of the great things about zero is you can keep adding zeros and it'll just make things bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, in Mesoamerica, of course, the main function of zero is to represent the conclusion or the completion of a period. And it's really used only in that calendrical sense, and it's not used in a much more widespread sense to represent quantities. And that, to me, is really something that's so different than the inscriptional traditions of Mesopotamia or Egypt or China, that we really need to investigate it more. Now, I'm not a Mesoamericanist, but I have a lot of friends who are. I have yet to convince them that this is as important as they think it is, because I think people are almost bored by the long count now. And among Mesoamericanists, they're like, oh, we've known that for 100 years. We don't need to know anything more about that. I think that's exactly wrong. I think actually to understand what are people using numbers for is the fundamental question. Once we understand that, we can answer it. So I don't have good answers to all your questions, but I think that would be the way, that's the way I hope to approach it. And that's the way that I've advocated elsewhere in my writing that we should be approaching it.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
A quick question. So I'm very much a data guy. I get a bit nervous when I see tallying sticks from very, very early on being classified as necessarily tallying sticks. Couldn't it also break?
You're breaking up a little bit. Could you?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jakob. Are you asking something about tallying, but I didn't quite hear what.
Yeah, tallying stick. The very early tallying sticks make me nervous, because can we be sure that it is a tallying stick and it is just not just decoration on the object?
We absolutely cannot be sure of that at all. And in fact, that's one of the challenges. So if we have, like, for instance, when we have a tallying stick like this Zuni tallying stick, we're very confident this is a tallying stick. We presumably have no debate here because it has this structure. But this kind of unstructured marking really raises a lot of questions. Like, how do we know that that's not just a representation of fur or the representation of some abstract marking? Or how do we establish that? Francesco D'Errico has been, and many others have been grappling with this question for decades. And in fact, it really goes back to the 1870s. But the research on this really took off in the late 60s when Alexander Marshak started to offer up these various theories about Paleolithic notations. The reason that D'Errico thinks that these are tallies, and I have my doubts, and I think we can only ever establish this on a case-by-case basis.
Because he's Italian and he wants to prove that Italians can count.
Ah, well, I won't besmirch Francesco. This is, of course, a French hyena femur, and I'm sure that wasn't his purpose at all. But I think for a lot of these there is a lot of debate, because but one of the ways you do it is that he's trying to figure out whether this was created at a single time by a single user or created by the use of a single tool. And so he's basically using use-where analysis. But he's not a semiotician, and he's not an expert in numerical notation. And I think in this case, I actually think, as I said when I showed this slide, I actually don't know whether this one's a number. And it's hard to know. I think there are some other ones from the Upper Paleolithic that I think that there's a strong enough case that there's some structure to it, that maybe there is. But I'm fully willing to acknowledge that trying to interpret much from this very small chunk of hyena bone is not going to get us very far.
Yeah, I would almost argue that given the size of the last quote tally mark on there, that these aren't tally marks because they're not consistent.
Yeah, they're cut marks that are basically part of one of these processes. For instance, if you're chopping on a surface and you're sort of using this and you're chopping something against this bone, Obviously, you're not trying to cut through the bone, or if you are, you're doing it very poorly, but you're doing something in a repetitive way. Or it's decorative, although this doesn't seem to be a decorative object. The swimming reindeer is clearly a decorative object, a mobiliary art. But again, even there, because that's open to the argument that that's decorative, I'm not sure that we know that this is a number, or if there is a number, what number it is. So, yeah.
But even with
ask a question.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sylvia. Stephen, may I ask a question? Going back to the issue of the quipu.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a question that has actually been in my mind since I read your 2009 paper on the coevolution of writing and numbers, numerical notations and writing.
Mm-hmm.
I heard everything you said about the quipu, and I agree it makes sense, but I've been wondering whether it would make sense to sort of have, would it be advantageous to have a distinction in terms of categories between three-dimensional things and bidimensional, so to speak, graphic stuff? So, in other words, separate the quipu from the rest of all other cases of early writing, because it was done materially, it was done differently in 3 dimensions and using colors and other kinds of devices. Do you think that investigating things with that categorical differentiation in mind would be enlightening in some aspects?
Absolutely. It really all depends what question you want to ask. The problem with the quipu is that for a really long time, people weren't even really interested in them as writing, that they were really treating it as something. And now we can really ask, oh, well, what if you had writing that was represented through knots? What would that look like? And how would that work? It, of course, would really help if we had a decipherment, which of course we don't have, but there's a lot of people who are busy working on it. But I'm perfectly happy to acknowledge, and this really derives from the use of the concept of modality, that understanding the way that knots work. So for instance, knots may really almost require one of these, what I've called cumulative numerical systems, that you're representing one knot equals one object. It's not necessary, but it seems to be maybe a fairly obvious way of doing it. I'm perfectly happy to then say, now this opens up a whole other set of questions. But again, I'm not an Andeanist, and so my job, I think, is really to take a cue from my colleagues who are doing work on the complex relationships between writing and weaving and knotting and all of the sorts of practices that might undergird the quipus, which could be quite different than the ones that are undergirding, for instance, notation on clay in Mesopotamia.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I had the problem with the origins of writing and whether it is strictly related to the early states in mind, of course. The quipu always play a key role in discussions on this topic, as you know.
Yes.
And it's always something that people either have in or do not include based on this three-dimensional aspect of it. So yeah, thank you.
You have many messages in the chat. Congratulations.
I'm seeing them all right now. They're lovely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
It was wonderful. Are there any more questions? One last question. Before we...
May I jump in here?
No, you could just email me, Jakob. You know how to get me.
I will email you, yes. Fantastic talk. It's always great to listen.
One last question before we say goodbye.
Good evening, Stephen. Good evening to everybody. I am Barbara Montecchi. If I may, I would like to ask a short question about the notation of fractional numbers, because you showed different ways in which whole numbers were notated or can be notated. And so I'd like to know if you have any comments or if you have detected any tendency in the notation of fractional numbers in early scripts?
Well, I just reviewed a lovely paper that appeared in the Journal of Archaeological Science
Oh,
very
who's
recently.
written that?
I don't know, Sylvia. You'll have to look that up and we'll find that. Because fractions are really interesting. One of the things that is really interesting about fractions is that whereas for numerical notations, they tend to use either a decimal base or something that's a multiple of 10. That for fractional notations, there's actually a lot more freedom to use different bases like base 12 or 16 or 8. And one of the reasons for that is actually very pragmatic, which is that these notations when you're working with fractions, it's very useful to have a lot of divisors for your numbers. You want to have nice even fractions. And so, things that divide, 10 divides into 1, 2, and 5, but that's kind of boring. And it's not very effective. So one of the differences when you're notating fractions is that you see more flexibility. So for instance, the Roman numerals are of course base 10 with this sub base of 5, but Roman fractions are base 12. So we tend to think that that's weird because we are living in such a decimalized world. But I actually don't think it's that weird at all. I think historically, we see those divisions between whole number notation and fractional notation. The other thing about fractional notation is it's much more closely tied to systems of weights and measures. It's tied to metrological practices in ways that we're not assuming that numerical notation is. And of course, whether something is a number or a weight or a measure is sometimes open to some debate. We don't necessarily have to commit ourselves one way or another. So I think there's lots of interesting stuff to do. There is no real substantive history of fractions from a comparative or global sense. At one point when I was originally writing my big book, Numerical Notation, I had thought to include a chapter on fractions, and I was gently told that I should not do so for reasons of time and space, because the book's already 500 pages long.
Oh,
and
no,
maybe
what a pity.
Next book.
I think it's a very,
Yes.
very important area that needs a comparative perspective to really understand that what fractions are doing is in some ways very different. And it doesn't build on tallying, because tallying is used for counting whole numbers of things and it's not used for counting portions of things.
I have one last question, actually. I love Barbara's question because it ties in nicely with something that we are very interested in Scribe, which is exactly that. But we are also interested in maybe shaking things up a bit in the sort of linear deterministic assumption that from one-to-one correspondences you get to abstract and one presupposes the other. Is there a way that we can shuffle things and see this as a, cognitively speaking, as a less deterministic, less predictable pattern?
Well, the best piece of evidence I have for that is that we still use one-to-one correspondence and tallying all the time, because if you're making an ongoing count, it's the way to do it. If you're sitting in a faculty meeting and you have to count votes on some motion, somebody will sit there and mark notches one by one, because that's the only practical way to do it. It doesn't mean that the person doesn't have an abstract number sense. And so I'm reluctant to, those words like abstract and concrete that get thrown around are really, really problematic words. And I don't think they have much use in this discussion. But I do think we ought to ask, what difference does it make cognitively to have numerical notation as opposed to along with tallying, as opposed to just tallying alone? But the problem with that is that's actually really, really difficult to answer. It's difficult to answer ethnographically today because you don't have, you can't just go in and tell people to start notating things. Never mind the fact that there are very, very few people who have no access to literacy whatsoever. And I don't think you can answer them historically in a straightforward way. So I'm very reluctant to go too far in terms of speculation in terms of that regard.
That you could tackle it from a neurological perspective with experiments.
That's true, and I don't think one of the reasons I wrote the new book is that I do think that it has maybe a broader audience than people who don't want to read a 500-page book on all of the numerical notations of the world. That maybe if you wanted to read a book, which I believe is selling for $35 and should be on sale within the next few weeks, if I'm allowed to put a little plug in for my book.
15th of December, actually.
Yeah, but I think it may be available sooner. We may have it in November sometime. But
Okay, great.
I know what Amazon is saying, but you know that I think we may get a little bit earlier. But one of the reasons I think that neuroscientists aren't asking the right sorts of questions, that they're asking great questions, but they're limited in the range of questions that they're asking because they're not aware of the historical data and they're not aware of the kinds of things that a cognitive history would provide to them in terms of even asking the right question. And I don't know the answer because I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do know that those questions would be really, really rich to investigate.
I agree that it takes a strong team of multidisciplinary expertise to tackle such a question. Any more questions from anyone before we say goodbye? I think we are done. Stephen, it was wonderful and great and really informative and fascinating. And now I know a new word, which is conspicuous computation, and I will use it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. We will, of course, have the edited video ready tomorrow on our channels, on YouTube, on the Inscribe Facebook page. We will be sending it to Stephen, of course, so that he can rewatch it. But we'll see you in 2 weeks' time with Felipe Rojas. Thank you so much, Stephen, for being here. We'll be in touch. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Lovely talk.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.